I sat in the courtroom while my father unraveled in public, his voice ricocheting off the wood-paneled walls as if volume alone could substitute for truth. He called me unstable, unfit, a wandering liability with no direction, no partner, no respectable life to anchor me. His words came out sharp and practiced, like he had rehearsed them in front of a mirror for years, waiting for an audience with authority. His face flushed darker with each sentence, veins rising along his temples, his finger trembling as he pointed at me like I was evidence of a crime instead of a person. He told the court I could not even speak for myself, that my silence proved incompetence, that someone needed to take control of my finances before I destroyed them on whatever people like me wasted money on. I didn't move. My hands rested neatly together, my posture relaxed, my breathing steady. I glanced at my watch, nodding the time with quiet satisfaction. Everything was unfolding exactly when it should. Across the bench, the judge watched him without interruption, her expression neutral in a way that should have worried him but didn't. He mistook stillness for agreement, composure for weakness, and that mistake had been shaping his future long before this morning. The judge finally leaned forward and asked a single question, softly delivered, yet heavy enough to change the temperature in the room. She asked whether he truly knew who I was. The effect was immediate and visible. At my father's side, his attorney froze mid-motion as a document slid across the table toward him. His confident posture collapsed into tension as his eyes scanned the page, color draining from his face, as though he had just read his own diagnosis. The courtroom fell into a silence that wasn't empty but thick, the kind that presses against your ears and makes every breath sound too loud. I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to. I focused instead on the thin beam of light cutting across the room, dust drifting lazily through it, my thoughts slipping backward to a winter evening months earlier when this confrontation had already been decided. The pause stretched, uncomfortable and unresolved, and in that space his certainty began to leak away, though he didn't yet realize it. That memory came back with clarity, sharp and detailed. It was the night before a holiday, gathered around the long dining table in the house he loved to remind everyone was his. The same house whose payments I had been quietly covering for years without his knowledge. He had laughed when I handed him my new business card, an open, dismissive laugh that landed like a slap. He tossed the card aside as if it were meaningless paper and asked whether consulting was just a polite word for unemployment now. He swirled an expensive drink, enjoying the sound of his own amusement, and told me I was playing dress-up instead of building a real life. I remembered the familiar heat in my face, the old roles settling over me again, the disappointment daughter who never measured up. But in the courtroom, that memory didn't sting anymore. It burned clean and focused, because while he mocked me that night, my firm had just secured a government contract large enough to change everything. He saw a failure. I saw the managing partner of a firm designed to trace money that people worked very hard to hide. And sitting there now, I was following his. His voice dragged me back to the present as he doubled down, insisting my silence proved something was wrong with me. He told the judge I was medicated, detached, incapable of handling my own affairs. He demanded control, demanded urgency, demanded to be believed. I adjusted my cuff, feeling the familiar weight of my watch settle against my wrist, and let him keep talking. Every word helped me. If I spoke, I would look defensive. If I reacted, I would play the part he had written for me. Silence let him look erratic. Silence let him expose himself. He moved on to my living situation next, describing it with theatrical disgust, calling it a rundown rental I was too ashamed to let family see. I almost smiled. He was describing a building I owned outright, a property I had renovated, managed, and leveraged with precision. The irony was exquisite. He paid rent there through a company name he never bothered to question, never realizing whose signature authorized his lease. By now his attorney was sweating, scrolling frantically, piecing together what his client still refused to see. I knew exactly what document had finally reached his hands. It wasn't an inheritance summary or a trust evaluation. It was my financial profile, comprehensive and unflattering to my father's narrative. I wasn't here to protect an inheritance. I had outgrown the need for one years ago. I was here because he had tried to erase me using the system meant to protect people, and that mistake had consequences. When I met the judge's eyes, she gave the slightest nod, confirmation that everything was in place. The structure was built. All that remained was to let him keep pulling on the thread. He accused me of having no income, no stability, no proof of competence. Each accusation sounded louder than the last, as if volume might turn fiction into fact. I stayed still, letting time do what it always does to lies under pressure. As he ranted about my lack of family and supposed isolation, my thoughts drifted again, this time to a weekday afternoon years earlier when 2 officers knocked on my door with paperwork claiming I was a danger to myself. The report said I was delusional, reckless, incapable of managing reality. The signature belonged to a doctor I had never met, a friend of my father, from a country club I had never set foot in. The plan had been simple. Detain me briefly, file emergency motions, seize control before I could respond. It failed because reality didn't match the story. My home was orderly. My demeanor calm. My laptop open to a live call with federal investigators reviewing an audit. The officers left. The report was flagged. I didn't retaliate then. I didn't need to. I chose patience instead, and patience gave me options my father never saw coming. The morning after that attempt, I formed a company with a name designed to disappear into paperwork. Through it, I approached his lenders quietly and offered them relief. They accepted eagerly. I acquired his obligations piece by piece, then extended new capital under terms he never read closely enough. He saw money arrive and assumed validation. He spent it like applause, buying symbols instead of stability, parading success he didn't actually own. I watched without interference, documenting every choice, every misuse, every violation. He mocked me again over dinner months later, telling me I was embarrassing for needing help, raising a glass in celebration of his own cleverness. He didn't know the car he bragged about was already collateral. Every mile reducing its value for him and increasing it for me. Back in the courtroom, he declared that my silence was fear, that I was nothing without him. I finally looked at him then, not with anger but with clarity. He wasn't evil. He was careless, and careless investments eventually fail. His attorney whispered urgently, but he waved him off, convinced he was winning. The judge's patience cooled into something sharper as she warned him to stop speaking. When he didn't, she enforced it. Then she began reading from the record. She explained calmly and precisely that I was not just his daughter. I was his creditor. He laughed at first, dismissing it as fantasy, until his lawyer physically reacted to the seal on the page. Federal, verified, executed. The room shifted again, this time decisively. When the judge detailed the property records, explaining that the building he had insulted belonged to me entirely, including the offices his firm occupied, his certainty finally fractured. He tried to argue technicalities, clinging to titles and assumptions that no longer mattered. He bragged about the firm that had saved him, never realizing he was praising the structure I had built. The judge turned another page and stated my role plainly, leaving no space for interpretation. The silence that followed was absolute. He stared at my signature like it was written in another language. He accused me of fraud, grasping for rules he didn't understand, celebrating too early when he thought he'd found a violation. I stood then, calm and deliberate, and told him the truth he had missed. I didn't own his firm. I owned his debt. I explained it without raising my voice, laying out the terms he had signed without reading, the triggers he had activated with his own mouth, the acceleration clause he had just satisfied on record. His lawyer knew before he did. The color left his face again, this time for good. I checked the time as I finished, nodding the balance due, the accounts empty, the protections unavailable to him. When he threatened bankruptcy, I corrected him, pointing to the personal guarantees, the cross-collateralization, the assets already pledged. By the time the judge dismissed the hearing and authorized enforcement, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. I walked out without a backward glance because closure doesn't require an audience. That night, as locks changed and signs came down, I felt nothing dramatic, just quiet. And quiet, I had learned, was power. I went home after the courthouse emptied, not to celebrate, not to replay the scene, but to sit in the stillness that comes after something heavy finally stops pressing on your chest. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt earned, not lonely. City noise hummed faintly through reinforced glass, distant and unimportant. I placed my keys on the counter, removed my jacket, and stood there longer than necessary, letting the absence of tension register in my body. For the first time in years, there was no next move to plan, no defensive posture to maintain, no threat disguised as concern waiting to surface. The hearing had not given me victory in the dramatic sense people imagine. It gave me finality, the kind that does not shout or demand recognition, the kind that simply closes a door and locks it. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly, aware that nothing else was required of me now. No explanations, no proof, no restraint. The system he tried to use to cage me had instead documented his unraveling in ink that could not be erased. The days that followed were procedural, methodical, and strangely calm. Notices were served, accounts frozen, titles transferred. Everything unfolded exactly as the paperwork said it would because paperwork is indifferent to emotion. I did not need to raise my voice or threaten anyone. I simply enforced agreements that already existed. Watching it happen taught me something important about power. Real power is quiet. It does not posture. It does not need to humiliate. It waits. When people talk about revenge, they imagine fire and spectacle. What they rarely understand is that the most complete consequences feel boring to everyone except the person who ignored the fine print. I attended meetings as usual, signed documents, reviewed reports. No one asked how I felt, and I appreciated that. My life did not need a narrative arc. It needed stability, and stability had finally arrived without asking permission. Occasionally, a memory surfaced without warning. A dismissive laugh. A comment delivered casually that took years to unlearn. A look that said I was temporary, secondary, replaceable. Those memories no longer had teeth, but I examined them anyway, curious rather than wounded. I realized how long I had mistaken endurance for loyalty, silence for peace. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly proving you exist. When that burden lifts, it leaves behind a strange openness, like space reclaimed after a demolition. I filled that space deliberately. I restructured my schedule. I delegated more. I stopped over-explaining. Boundaries that once felt radical now felt obvious. I understood, finally, that distance is not cruelty. Distance is often the most ethical response to someone committed to misunderstanding you. News of what happened traveled in fragments, distorted by second-hand retellings and assumptions. I did not correct them. Letting people believe incomplete stories became another form of freedom. Those who needed villains would find one. Those who understood systems saw exactly what had happened without being told. A few messages arrived, cautious and curious, asking whether things were really as bad as they sounded. I responded politely and briefly, declining to elaborate. Closure does not require consensus. It requires alignment between your actions and your values. I had that now. The rest was background noise. Work continued, demanding and precise. The firm expanded carefully, intentionally. We took on cases that required patience and integrity, not bravado. I built teams that valued verification over ego, documentation over assumptions. In quieter moments, I reflected on how close I had come to losing years to someone else's fear masquerading as authority. That awareness sharpened my focus. I became ruthless about protecting my time, my autonomy, my peace. Not aggressive. Just uncompromising. There is a difference, and learning it changes how you move through the world. One evening, months later, I drove past the old office building without slowing down. The lights were off, the space already repurposed, the sign replaced. I felt no satisfaction, no bitterness, just distance. The chapter was not dramatic enough to memorialize, and that was exactly right. People imagine that confronting the source of long-term harm will feel explosive. In reality, it often feels quiet, anticlimactic, and deeply grounding. Healing is not a moment. It is a sequence of ordinary days, no longer shaped by someone else's volatility. I stopped thinking of the situation as something I survived and started seeing it as something that clarified me. It showed me how systems work, how narratives are built, how easily authority can be abused when no one questions it. It also showed me my own capacity for restraint. I had not won by becoming louder or crueler. I had won by being precise. That distinction mattered. Precision leaves less collateral damage. It also leaves fewer regrets. There is a temptation to frame stories like this as cautionary tales or empowerment slogans. I resist that. This was not about proving strength or delivering justice. It was about ending interference, about removing a hand that had been on my life's steering wheel without permission. The outcome was not symbolic. It was practical. And practicality, I learned, is the most underrated form of self-respect. I no longer track where he is or what he does. That information has no utility. Indifference is not something you force. It arrives when a problem stops being relevant. When someone loses the ability to affect your trajectory, they also lose your attention. That is not forgiveness. It is resolution, the clean kind. People often ask how to deal with toxic family dynamics, expecting advice that sounds like confrontation or distance or therapy. Sometimes the answer is simpler and harder. Stop subsidizing harm. Stop negotiating your autonomy. Read what you sign. Understand leverage. Choose silence strategically, not passively. And when the moment comes, act without theatrics. Most stories end with a moral neatly tied at the bottom. This one doesn't need that. It ends with a locked door, a balanced ledger, and a life that finally belongs to the person living it. If that kind of ending resonates with you, then you already understand the point.